opens the door to a dynamic positional battle, aiming for queenside space advantage and potentially a fianchetto setup. Securing the d5 square, this solidifies black's central pawn structure, preparing for potential d5 advances and influencing queenside development. Securing the center instantly, this thrust prepares for rapid piece development and influences the d5 square. Instantly challenging the center, this pawn thrust creates immediate positional tension and opens crucial diagonals for black's pieces. Securing the center further, white prepares for a robust pawn structure while keeping options open. Developing the knight here opens critical lines for the queen and supports central pawn advances. Developing the knight to c3 supports the d4 pawn and prepares to contest central control, offering flexibility in how white proceeds. Solidifying the center, black mirrors white's ambition while preparing to develop the bishop and challenge white's central pawn mass. Pinning the knight immediately initiates a positional duel, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's potential weaknesses later. Seizing the pawn immediately offers a slight material advantage, but concedes central pawn control and potentially delays development. Boldly seizing central space, this pawn push challenges black's queenside pawn, aiming to dictate the game's rhythm. Aggressively grabbing central pawn territory with the queen's flank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure, but it might overextend and invite tactical threats. Opening a queenside attack, white immediately challenges black's pawn expansion, aiming to disrupt its cohesive structure. Developing the bishop to this square actively contests the center and prepares to castle, reinforcing black's position. Solidifying the center and preparing for castling, this retreat aims for tranquil development and avoids immediate tactical fireworks. Developing the knight to d7 frees the f6 knight, aiming to castle swiftly and reinforce the queenside pawns. Securing the monarch opens avenues for counterplay and reinforces the central pawn structure. Challenging white's central control, this pawn push aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially gain space on the queenside. Retreating the knight allows control of the d5 square and prepares for queenside expansion, subtly shifting the battleground. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn push immediately addresses white's kingside ambitions. Sacrificing the bishop clears the d-file for potential queen pressure and offers a favorable pawn structure exchange. Reclaiming the knight solidifies your central pawn structure and prepares a queenside advance. Probing forward, this thrust injects immediate tension, forcing black to confront the advanced pawn's reach. Reclaiming central influence and setting up a knight outpost on d5, this repositioning cleverly leverages the compromised pawn chain. Recapturing on c4 stabilizes white's central pawn presence and opens lines for queen activity. Solidifying the central pawn structure while preparing to develop further, this move offers a sound, unassuming response to white's bishop capture. Developing the knight to its most active square, aiming to pressure black's central pawn structure. Challenging the center's pawn structure, this counterthrust aims to disrupt white's space advantage and open lines for black's pieces. Forcing black's king out from the safety of its pawn shield might expose vulnerabilities later. Safeguarding the monarch from immediate threats, this maneuver aims to consolidate the kingside and prepare for potential counterplay, though it somewhat obstructs development. Shedding the central pawn unlocks this bishop, eyeing potential breakthroughs in the queenside structure. Reclaiming the pawn establishes a balanced pawn structure, but beware of white's queenside pressure. A tactical reshuffle, aiming to dislodge the pinned knight and gain outpost control. Developing the bishop to its optimal defensive square, this prepares to unblock the rook for potential counterplay. A bold knight sortie ignites central action, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for attack. Challenging the knight on d4 is a good idea, but watch out for the subsequent tactical possibilities. Asserting dominion over the central files, this rook pivots to seize the open c file, aiming to pressure black's king. Seeking safer pastures, black's monarch abandons central dangers for a more secure perimeter, initiating a defensive reorganization. Elevating the bishop to a commanding outpost on c6, Black's king now faces a daunting siege with limited retreat options. Embracing the exchange frees up Black's pieces from that cramped bishop, aiming to contest the central files. Seizing the open file, White dramatically enhances their queenside pressure, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure around Black's king. Centralizing the queen offers a crucial defensive anchor, while preparing a dynamic queenside counterplay. Centralizing the queen enhances pressure and prepares for potential pawn advances. Consolidating the queen's rook onto the open file is a good step toward potential pressure. The rook redeploys, preparing to contest the open file and potentially support a central pawn advance. Swapping off the bishop opens a vital line, but forfeits crucial defensive pressure. Instantly seizing the open file, White fortifies the queenside and prepares to exploit the compromised Black king's safety. Asserting control over the open d-file is paramount for Black's rooks. Solidifying the king's shelter now, preparing for a potential pawn advance or knight repositioning. A strategic repositioning, the knight heads towards central influence, potentially disrupting White's established pawn structure. Pushing the pawn aggressively probes the knight, aiming to disrupt Black's coordination and gain crucial queenside space. Probing the queenside, this knight seeks safer avenues away from the immediate pressure. Asserting control over the queenside, this maneuver aims to restrict Black's knight and prepare a queenside push. Trading queens here decisively simplifies the position, allowing Black to focus on regaining lost material and exploiting the open files. Liberating the knight allows it to control crucial central squares and support an eventual kingside push. Securing the open file now with the rook is essential for Black's counterplay. Reclaiming the open file is paramount, solidifying control that was temporarily ceded. Relocating the king from the open files, aiming for greater security and potential regrouping. Pawns advance to pry open space, aiming to isolate Black's knight. Repositioning the knight to c3 intends to contest the d-file and potentially harass White's queenside pawns. A bold raid seeks to disrupt Black's pawn structure, but the knight's long journey might prove perilous. This daring pawn thrust now forces Black to decide between recapturing the pawn or defending his exposed king. Cleverly exploiting the pinned knight on c3, White aims to disrupt Black's structure and gain a pawn. Clearing the bishop from danger allows it to eye the central pawn structure and support a potential counterplay. This piece withdrawal seeks to regain a lost pawn while creating a more dynamic central pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight for active rook play, seeking counterplay along the open file. Unlocking the queenside with that knight swap opens a path for your rooks. Capturing the pawn unleashes a passed pawn on the queenside, demanding immediate attention and creating dynamic imbalances. Unlocking the open c-file, this capture strategically isolates Black's queenside pawns and prepares a decisive endgame advantage. A decisive exchange, opening the file for White's rook and simplifying towards a potentially favorable endgame. King activation begins now, seeking safety and preparing for future pawn advances. Re-establishing the rook's outpost on the 7th rank is a sensible positional adjustment. This pawn advances, forcing the knight to retreat and creating a clear path for the rook to penetrate on the open file. Relocating the monarch to the center aims to escape the cramped queenside and potentially reactivate it later. Prying open the queenside allows pawns to advance and potentially trap the Black bishop. A daring venture towards the queenside, seeking active counterplay and potential passed pawn support. The rook exchange simplifies into a race, where White's passed pawn on the queenside gains decisive momentum. Reclaiming lost material, Black introduces a dynamic endgame with pawns scattered across the board. Pushing the pawn further opens lines and gains central space, creating a dynamic endgame scenario. The rook's deployment to the queenside aims to disrupt White's pawn majority, creating potential weaknesses. King hunt imminent, The monarch must flee the checking onslaught. The king shuffles towards the queenside, seeking refuge from the open file. A quiet advance, the pawn marches forward, opening paths for the rook to dominate the newly created pathway. Activating the rook on the queenside offers a chance to disrupt white's pawn advances. Instantly freezing the rook's mobility, this pawn advances to claim decisive space and potentially seal the game. The black king, now exposed, must seek shelter behind the remaining pawns. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now aims to restrict black's rook activity.